Thank you. Our text for this morning is Revelation chapter 11, beginning at verse 14, and we're going to move on to chapter 12, verse 6. I know we're going right through a chapter division, but chapter divisions aren't always helpful. Revelation chapter 11, the first portion of our read, 14 to 19, will concern that time when the seventh trumpet sounds and the nations begin to be Christianized. And then starting in chapter 12, we start the beginning of 3 chapters of defining the Antichrist in more detail. But first, the Christianization of nations and what that'll look like. Revelation chapter 11, verse 14. The second woe is past, and behold, the third woe will come anon. And the seventh angel blew the trumpet, and there were great voices in heaven, saying, The kingdoms of the world are our Lord's and his Christ's, and he shall reign forevermore. Then the 24 elders which sat before God on their seats fell upon their faces and worshipped God, saying, We give thee thanks, Lord God Almighty, which art and which was and which art to come, for thou hast received thy great might. For thou hast received thy great might, and hast obtained thy kingdom. And the Gentiles were angry, and thy wrath is come, and the time of the dead that thou should be judged, and that thou shouldest give reward unto the servants, the prophets, and to thy saints, and to them that fear thy name, to small and great, and shouldest destroy them which destroy the earth. Then the temple of God was opened in heaven, and there was seen in the temple the ark of his covenant. And there were lightnings and voices and thunderings and earthquakes and much hail. And then appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon was under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was with child, and cried, travailing in birth, and was pained, ready to be delivered. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, for behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his heads. And his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven, and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman which was ready to be delivered to devour her child when she had brought it forth. So she brought forth a man-child, which should rule all nations with a rod of iron, and that her child was taken up unto God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. The title of our message this morning, Revelation chapter 14 through chapter 12, verse 6, The Woman and the Beast, part 1. We'll be describing the Roman papacy as the beast in all of chapter 12, 13, and 14. Here's our introduction. The reader now awaits the 7 vials to be poured out upon the 4th kingdom to be destroyed, which is the Latin Church. But before these vials are poured out, we must read and understand the nature of that antichristian empire, the Roman papacy. The next 3 chapters will expose the Latin Church as the Antichrist. We must understand that it was done to be, that it has done, we must understand what it has done to be worthy of destruction before we see it destroyed by the vials. The text now moves to a general but thorough explanation of the nature of the Antichrist so that it may be easily identified by every reader in every generation. Once identified, we'll better understand why the Latin Church must be subject and victim of the vials. There are 3 points to our message this morning. Verses 14 to 19, heaven and earth react to the blowing of the 7th trumpet. Verses 1 and 2 of chapter 12, the woman with child. The woman is the confessing church. And verses 3 to 6, the red dragon, which is the papacy, and her hatred of the woman with child, who is the confessing church. From chapter 10 through chapter 11, verse 14, we had a break between the sounding of the 6th trumpet and the sounding of the 7th trumpet. In this break, we were given a brief glimpse of the 4th kingdom to be destroyed. It was prophesied that the Latin Church would reign for 1,260 years, or 42 months, same thing, and that it would be opposed by a small confessing church. Remember, that was the 2 witnesses, the small confessing church. Now, in these next 3 chapters, the Latin Church will be revealed in greater detail, as well as its hateful relationship with the small confessing church. In chapter 11, verses 14 to 19, which is our first point, God will give the church a glimpse of the end of Antichrist for its encouragement. When we get to chapter 12, we have a retelling of the story of Antichrist, but in greater length and detail. I won't go through our chart because I know we've gone through that many weeks. We'll go right to our first point, but you can be reminded of the various things we've dealt with there with the seals and the trumpet. We come to our first point, verses 14 to 19. Heaven and earth react to the blowing of the seventh trumpet. 14. The second woe is past, and behold, the third woe will come anon. Since chapter 10 through chapter 11 through 14, verse 14, interrupted the text after the sixth trumpet, we now return to the topic of the seventh trumpet, or the third woe. We are told that the third woe, or seventh trumpet, will come anon. And that word anon means soon. This means that while the time between the first and the second woe, which I know this gets confusing, which is also the fifth and the sixth trumpet, was long, the time between the second woe, or the sixth trumpet, and the third woe, which is the seventh trumpet, will be relatively short. I'll give you some dates here. The time that elapsed between the first two woes was very long. The first woe, which was the fifth trumpet, began in 612 and ended 150 years later in 762. The second woe, or sixth trumpet, began in 1281 and continued for 391 years until 1672. That means that 609 years passed between the first and the second woe, or the fifth and the sixth trumpet. Now we're told that the time between the end of the second woe, which was in 1672, and the third woe, which will be the end of the Roman papacy, will be quick. It says will come anon. Now, so far, 345 years have passed between the second and the third woe. So by the term short, meaning anon, we mean at least more than 345 years. But in other words, just to summarize it, what the verse is saying is that the time between the first and second woe was very long. But the time between the second and third woe will not be as long. That's all it's saying. Verse 15. And the seventh angel blew the trumpet, and there were great voices in heaven, saying, the kingdoms of this world are our Lord's and his Christ, and he shall reign forevermore. Here we read that the seventh angel sounded the seventh trumpet, and this loud noise was accompanied by great voices in heaven. These great voices are expressions of joy by the saints in heaven on hearing that the seventh and last of the trumpets has been sounded. The sounding of the seventh trumpet is the end of the antichrist. The seventh trumpet is the same earthquake of chapter 11, verse 13. It is a universal change in government and authority. The universal change is this: the kingdoms of this world are our Lord's and his Christ, and he shall reign forevermore. In other words, when that seventh trumpet sounds, this is the beginning of the millennial reign of Christ, when he will no longer allow his subjects to rebel. When the seventh trumpet sounds, the seven vials and complete destruction of the Antichrist will be past history. This will allow all nations of the world to no longer be deceived and to become kingdoms that belong to Christ. We will know that this prophecy has been fulfilled when we see worldwide revolutions, also called earthquakes, in which both church and state transfer their allegiance from paganism and papacy to the rightful owners of that allegiance, who is Christ. Gospel ministers and Christians heads of state will no longer serve the God of this world, but seek the glory of God and to do his will. Man will no longer regard himself as the highest authority on earth, but rule in subservience to the laws established by Christ. This is the millennial reign of Christ for which the saints in heaven prayed. In chapter 6, verse 10, verses 16 and 17, still talking about that moment where the millennial reign has begun. 16 and 17. Then the 24 elders which sat before God on their seats fell upon their faces and worshipped, saying, we give thanks, Lord God Almighty, which art and which wast and which art to come, for thou hast received thy great might and hast obtained thy kingdom. So, when the invisible church, here called the 24 elders, that meets in heaven, see the sounding of the seventh trumpet following the third woe, they realize the visible church is now emancipated or freed from the cruelty of the fourth kingdom, which is the Latin church. We are told that they fell upon their faces and worshiped God, saying, "We give thee thanks." They immediately offer their thanks for two reasons. First, because at the sounding of the seventh trumpet, God will have removed all future enemies of the church. And secondly, because they worship the justice of God, who has seen fit to punish those who harassed and murdered the saints of God. Now, we do not rejoice at the calamity of the heathen, but we do rejoice in God's judgment to destroy all that oppose him. Now, these are those saints who died in Christ, they're the ones rejoicing, that were never blind to the immoral character of the world and are gratified now to see it overturned for Christ. This time, the fall of the Antichrist and the beginning of the millennial reign of Christ will be the greatest reversal in human history. It will be a time when the Antichrist is overthrown, Satan will be bound and no longer able to deceive the nations. A time when truth and righteousness, peace and joy will flood the whole earth. That's Christ's kingdom that we reject now because we don't want any of those things. Verse 18. And the Gentiles were angry, and thy wrath is come, and the time of the dead that they should be judged, and that thou shouldest give reward unto thy servants the prophets and to the saints, and to them that fear thy name, to small and great, and shouldest destroy them which destroy the earth. In this book, we're not given many details as to what the literal fall of the Antichrist will look like. We are going to get some more details later, but not much so far. Or how the heathen will even react to the fall of Antichrist. The text spends its time on dwelling about the positive effects of this reversal. What little we are told about the heathen reaction to the millennial reign of Christ is recorded here in this verse. We're told that the Gentiles, who we've already seen stands for the heathen, were angry because their power over men and their rebellion against God is brought to a swift end. That's why they're angry. Not only is there a reversal of power, with the godless heathen governments being replaced by Christ's government, but they will also receive the wrath of Christ. This will be a time of judgment that foreshadows the final judgment when Christ returns. It will no longer be a time when the wicked prosper and the righteous are shamed, like we live in now. Now all will be made right. The wicked will be judged for their wickedness, and the righteous will be rewarded for their righteousness and their fear of God. The punishment of the wicked and rewarding of the innocent will be more pronounced than any time in history. Verse 19. Then the temple of God was opened in heaven, and there was seen in his temple the ark of his covenant. And there were lightnings and voices and thunderings and an earthquake and much hail. Once again, at the sounding of the seventh trumpet, the doors of the temple of God, heaven, are now said to be opened, and we can see into heaven. Heaven may be said to have been closed during the Papacy, because their theology closed off the doors of heaven to the people in the world. The grace of God had been replaced by the Catholic Church doctrine of good works. But now the grace of God, we see in this vision, is prepared to come forward again and flood the earth. Heaven was closed to the majority of the people upon the earth during the reign of the Latin Church. Now this grace is freely offered and eagerly received by the majority of the world's population. This grace here is represented by the Ark of his Covenant, which was, of course, a picture of Christ. God symbolically comes forward in order to mete out his justice in lightnings and voices and thunderings and an earthquake and much hail. These are all representative of God's presence, his avenging judgments, and the awful deserved punishment of the Latin Church. Now we sort of change gears here, and we begin the beginning of a new section, chapter 12, 13, and 14, which you had a little book that had a little explanation of the Roman papacy. Now we're going to get a 3-chapter book that has a greater book, you might call it, that's going to be a bigger explanation of the Roman Catholic Church. And we start that right now, here in verses 1 to 6. Our next point is in verses 1 to 2, the woman with child, and the woman is, of course, the confessing church. Verse 1. And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon was under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. So now the text switches focus. No longer are we given the promising details about that time when the Latin Church is destroyed and the Christianization of all nations began. Now we must go back to the beginning of the 1260 years of the Latin Church. Now, In this and the next 3 chapters, we're going to trace in more detail the rise of the papal church and its persecution of the confessing church. John's going to give us an overview of the Roman papacy, covering the most prominent features of that anti-church. This is a kindness extended to the reader so that the confessing church, which we saw was the 2 witnesses, may be able to identify the enemy, understand its danger to the true religion, and to be wise so as to resist its subtle and ever-changing persona, because the Catholic Church becomes whatever you want it to be. John here now records a vision. In this vision, he begins by describing the true church, or the confessing church. The confessing church here is described as a woman. The woman symbolizes the true church. The woman is clothed with the sun, which stands for the righteousness of Christ. The woman also has a crown of 12 stars, which represents the ministry of the apostles. So the true church will follow the teaching of the apostles. Let's see what this woman is doing. Verse 2. And she was with child and cried, travailing in birth, and was pained, ready to be delivered. The true church is the woman striving to bring forth a child, because the true church's job is to build the church by bringing forth spiritual children. But it's a struggle to bring up children with apostolic doctrine, discipline, and the right administration of the sacraments, because this woman is part of a larger church that forbids such teaching. So it will be a struggle to raise godly children during the reign of the Latin Church. This is also symbolic of the true church trying to give birth to the gospel. It will not be easy to bring forth gospel truths or to birth the true gospel during the reign of the great red dragon. So we have this vision of this woman who's trying to bring forth children. I mean, this might as well be us sitting in this room, because that's who we are. We are the true church trying to bring forth godly children in a deceived world. It's the same thing. Verses 3 to 6. The red dragon, who you'll see is the papacy, and her hatred of the women with child confessing church. Verse 3. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, for behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his head. So here in the church there's another sign. The first sign was the woman. The second sign is the great red dragon. We're first told that this dragon has 7 heads. This is explained more in Revelation chapter 17, verse 9. It says this, and here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains, on which the woman sitteth. So we're told that the 7 heads sit upon 7 mountains. This gives us the location of the great red dragon. There's only one city in the world that is said to sit upon 7 mountains, or 7 hills, and it is Rome. It's often called the city of 7 hills. So we know that this great red dragon is from Rome. The great red dragon is also said to have 10 horns. The 10 horns represent the 10 provinces that belong to that empire, the governors of which ruled like 10 kings. We know this from Revelation chapter 17, verse 12, which reads, and the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings. So the city of Rome was divided into 10 provinces. But we'll look at that history in more detail when we get to the 17th chapter of Revelation. I'll tell you what those, I'll give you very specifics as to what those are when we get to the 17th chapter. The 7 crowns upon his head represent the 7 forms of government. In Revelation 17 we read, and there are 7 kings. 5 are fallen, and 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. The 7 forms of government that the Romans had, by the way, are, they had kings, consuls, tribunes, decemvir, which is Latin for a ruling body of 10, dictators, emperors that were pagans, and then emperors that were Christians. John has already seen the first 5, that's why the text says 5 are fallen. The pagan emperors were current, that's why it says, and 1 is. And there's 1 yet to come, and that is when all the leaders are Christians, ruling in the millennial reign of Christ. But we'll also look at that in a lot more detail when we get to chapter 17. I just wanted to give you a taste of what this great red dragon with 7 horns, or 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns was. It's also interesting that the primary color of this dragon is red. I put that on the cover of the bulletin for you to see. Because red is is red because red or scarlet is the primary color used by Rome, especially for its cardinals. Verse 4, we're going to learn more about this red dragon. Verse 4, and his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth, and the dragon stood before the woman which was ready to be delivered to devour her child when she had brought it forth. The key to understanding the tail of the beast is found in Isaiah 9:15, which reads this, the ancient and honorable, he is the head, and the prophet that teacheth lies, he is the tail. Isaiah says that the prophet that teaches lies is the tail. The tail is symbolic of a false ministry. Here it is said that the tail or false ministry of the Latin church will destroy, kill, or cast out 1/3 of the true ministers, here called stars, which is exactly what the ministers were called in Revelation chapters 1 through 3. We also read how this dragon stands over the woman, the true church, waiting for anyone who becomes born into the true faith so that they can immediately devour it. In the 17th chapter, we'll read that this vision astonished the Apostle John. John's astonished at this vision because he sees the Latin church, who claims to stand for Christ, destroying the true church, who are the real witnesses of Christ. That's why it was astonishing to him. It's astonishing to John that one church would claim to be the true church, but is actually the biggest persecutor of the true church. This is also why Revelation often refers to this conflict between the Latin church and the confessing church as a mystery, like the mystery of Babylon. It is an astonishing mystery that the church claiming to follow Christ would destroy those who seek to follow Christ in sincerity. Verse 5. So she, that is the woman, the true church, brought forth a man-child, which should rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was taken up unto God into his throne. So we read that this woman who's trying to give birth, but the red beast dragon is standing over it, trying to devour it immediately. But this woman is going to be slightly successful during the reign of the dragon, in that she will successfully birth godly children, but always under threatening circumstances. The true church will manage to keep the dragon away from her children during the reign of the dragon, but only in small doses. But this verse also tells us that a time would come when this small confessing church will no longer be easily destroyed by the dragon. A time will come when the dragon is subdued by God, and the true church will give birth to a man-child. The small child grows up to be a man, in other words. The small confessing church is going to grow up to be a man-sized church. This man-child is the growing confessing church, and this church will eventually rule all nations with a rod of iron. Eventually the woman will prevail and succeed in bringing forth spiritual children that will rule over all nations, but this will not take place until the millennial reign of Christ. The confessing church is to be encouraged by this verse. It is to keep making spiritual children, because the day will come when these children will no longer be the minority, as we could say about our children today, but they will become the majority. Verse 6, and the woman fled into wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. But now John explains that this ruling over all nations is not going to happen anytime soon. The woman must first flee to the wilderness for a period of 1,260 days, which we know is years. We know that the wilderness is a place where people go often to escape danger, or because they're not permitted in the towns. It's an obscure place. Yet the wilderness is not so far removed that they should perish in the wilderness, you'll notice. The wilderness is a place that God had already foreordained that the true church should dwell. God both prepares the wilderness for his people, and he feeds them in the wilderness for this duration of 1,260 years. This wilderness church has gone by many names. It's consisted of the Valdensians, the Lollards, the Huguenots, the followers of Huss, and many others. And the wilderness church, of course, was given a great boost during the time of the Reformation, but will not be completely out of the wilderness until all nations convert to true Christianity and the papacy is destroyed. So in these 6 verses, we have been introduced to the principal characters in this 3-chapter struggle. The woman is the true church trying to build the church spread the gospel, and forward a godly seed. But the woman is opposed by the great red dragon, which stands for the Latin Church. The great red dragon will use its power over a span of 1,260 years to kill, silence, and defame the true church, which is the woman. Let us pray.